Hello, beautiful community. This is going to be a more analytical chat, and we're going to go a little quicker than usual. So if you want something gentle and more grounding, and you haven't seen the previous videos here, go and watch those instead of this one. This is going to be a bit abrupt, and you're going to feel a little bit of whiplash from it. But what I ask for you to do when I give a little bit of an analytical picture, especially when I throw bits of analysis out there, I want you not to absorb the bits of analysis, but to absorb the process of their generation, right? And that's what a healthy introjection of what I'm sharing means for you. So if I'm doing a backhand, you don't have to do a backhand. You have to maybe have a look if there is something interesting in the way I've done my shot selection. And you could actually say, no, backhand is wrong. I'm going to do something else. So with that, let's get going. And we'll cover the problem that the Commentariat has run into when it comes to the proportionality of Israel's response. We will talk about the response of Western actors to Israel and what a citizen might want of Western actors, a citizen of a Western country, what they might want their government to say or do. And we'll talk about the way what's happening is hurting Ukraine, whatever view of it one takes, actually. And that'll be part of a bigger point that I think might appear in the next video on the main channel, which is about how increasingly understanding what is happening in a particular conflict will require us to understand the multiplicity of games being played between various large and medium-sized states. So let's jump forward. What Israel will do will not work at the level of Israel's medium and long-term security. The reason it won't work is because you cannot guarantee Israel's security effectively unless you take concrete steps toward addressing the fundamental Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. Unless you work toward a solution toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and take steps in that direction, which is hard to do. But unless you do it, you're not going to get security. The reason it's hard is, of course, because Israel has recently in particular, a period where it's been run by a Jewish supremacist government that is anti-democratic and authoritarian. And at the same time, on the Palestinian side, there is very little constructive agency, genuine willpower for a solution. Willpower and agency toward a solution is absent on all sides in a significant form. So it's not going to work. But it could work in the short term, right? You could put off Hezbollah from attacking you. You could significantly deplete Hamas. I'll talk about the civilian consequences shortly. But that would be security in the short term. And even in the short term, let alone in the medium and long term, it's bad for Israel's security to make life that is utterly hellish for folks in Gaza an even worse kind of otherworldly hell. But Israel has to do this in some form because it's a state. And when states get attacked, no matter how complicit they are in the layers that generated this atrocity, but when states are attacked, and notice that Hamas's attack was utterly appalling and evil and involved massacre, torture. It would have triggered connections the Israelis feel toward not just the Holocaust, but the pogroms. So, wow, it's extraordinary. And do not underestimate how much shock, outrage, and resentment Israelis are feeling now. Revulsion, not resentment. But the point is that any state will take violent action in response to this, even if it's not constructive. So there is an element of necessity here. You should analyze this in terms of proportionality, and we'll talk about that shortly. But there is an element of inevitable state action. Any state will respond with significant violence in this situation. There is an inevitability here. Now, I'd say it's even worse than this, because the way Gaza is arranged really means that even if Israel took mild action relative to what they're doing, what they will do, that mild action would itself probably constitute war crimes because of the number of civilians they're going to have to kill. So, yeah. And the distinction, of course, here is between not purposefully aiming to kill civilians, which Israel is not doing, on the whole, and purposefully aiming to avoid killing civilians, right? These are different things, right? That you're not intentionally killing civilians is one story, but you could be you could entirely avoid intentionally killing civilians, but then take no special steps to prevent the deaths of civilians, right? So keep that distinction in mind. And the balance that we're really looking at here is a balance that is sort of age-old in historical experience. And it's, if you're defending yourself, how many war crimes are you allowed to commit? Especially if you're in a situation where you can't defend yourself without committing at least some. Let's talk about how the Commentariat has failed. Just and Unjust Wars by Michael Walzer is a wonderful thing to read. He's a philosopher of the older generation, with whose views, often in disagreement, my own views have beautifully developed and danced. Very wonderful man. Let's talk about the failure of the Commentariat. I made a tweet about this earlier. I said, it seems that many commentators have simply decided to keep saying that Israel must abide by international law and minimize casualties to save themselves from giving an ongoing moral and legal assessment of the proportionality of Israel's response. So we've really got a situation that is very crudely analogous to you seeing your neighbor chasing an intruder and chucking grenades at them. And they were genuinely in danger from the intruder, but they're chucking grenades at them. And then you are there on the sidelines, asked about what you think of this situation, and you say, "Oh no, I'm always in favor of people acting in self-defense, as long as it's proportionate, of course, and doesn't kill any bystanders." But do you think grenades will endanger people around? Surely they will. So do you take a view on whether they're bad, or whether they're inevitable, or whether they are bad but exceptionally justified in this case? Yeah, well, of course I just support self-defense, as long as it's proportionate. Unacceptable, dear Commentariat, unacceptable. You need to genuinely take one of several positions, and you can't avoid taking a position. You need to say that you think Israel's actions are unacceptable in their balance of proportionality. You need to say that Israel's actions perhaps constitute various kinds of war crimes, but exceptionally they're justified because of the gruesomeness of the attack Israel experienced, let's say. Or you've got to say that this is just inevitably what a state would do, and it's naive beyond a certain point to debate how good or bad it is. You've got to choose. You cannot make these lame statements knowing what's going to come in the next days and weeks. You can't make these statements clearly constructed to protect you from taking a view. Your job is to take a view if that's your job. Western state discourse. There are two elements here. One is telling Israel to retain a level of proportionality. Has that been done rather weakly. Opposition leader in the UK, Keir Starmer, has said that Israel has the right to withhold power and water from Palestinians on the radio, so it's not clear how definitive that statement is, but then said that everything should be done within international law, and perhaps there's a tension there. Blinken has said that behind the scenes he discussed humanitarian needs of people living in Gaza. He discussed possibilities for safe passage for civilians, and he adds, "We will always be there by your side." So there is a weak issuing of caution to Israel in a way that makes you feel it's just words. Now, be careful. It's very difficult for the US administration to criticize Israel. We can say as citizens that we don't like what our governments are doing, but there's also a realism about what we can expect of them. 2 is what we might call politicization. That is completely missing. That's to say, if we frame this in terms of what a citizen would want their political representatives to say or do toward Israel at this point, then as a citizen I would want and I would recommend some politicization, which is to say, we feel you, it's unbelievable what you're going through. At the same time, there's also some tough love. We're not going to just support you all the way without seeing steps toward a solution to this crisis. Where are these steps? Where are your steps toward a two-state solution? We want some statements on that, and we want them now. What about all of these settlements that are growing? We want some solutions about that. So we want some concrete demonstrations of commitment to solving the fundamental problem here, and not just engaging in the retaliatory violence that will produce certain solutions in the short term. That tough love is really a hard ask, but as a citizen, why the hell not? I ask it, and of course I find it unacceptable when my political representatives do not produce it. That tying is really, 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 really important. And one thing I recommend in terms of the analysis of the situation is that Israel is practicing 3 interconnected things: military occupation, colonial rule, and apartheid. And I recommend these essentially analytically so that you understand what's going on. And it's only by understanding the interactions between the 3 that you're really going to understand Israel's policy. Now, this is not some kind of ideological, anti-colonial, self-congratulatory point. It's important to not Disneyfy victims. And we're not doing that. We're saying things that are very clearly, by a very long margin, true, and indeed compatible with a constructive picture of Zionism. If you're committed to a home for the Jews in the form of the State of Israel, you want that project to work. Deeply recognizing challenges, deeply recognizing what Israel needs to rectify and what Israel is doing wrong is absolutely a precondition for the flourishing, which is a long shot at the moment, but for the flourishing of a Zionist project in the future. A Zionist project flourishing is not Israel existing. It's Israel existing safely, well, and ethically to a certain extent, right? So a good Zionist acknowledges these 3 things. But that does not mean that we're saying this as Disneyfication. Don't believe Disneyfication, right? When we look at, and this is what Yuval Noah Harari has been saying very constructively in the last few days, victims are rarely purely victims. They're also perpetrators. Perpetrators are rarely purely perpetrators. They're also victims. That's not always true. It's not true in the Russo-Ukrainian war. The Russians are perpetrators there all the way. But we've got to have the capacity to recognize that you can be both in many, many contexts, right? And even with the formation of the State of Israel and the plight to the Palestinians at that point, we do not want Disney, right? We don't want to deny that Palestinians also ethnically cleansed Jews. There was ethnic cleansing going around. One side did it more and won and so on and so forth. But we do not want prettification here, just like we wouldn't want it with Ukraine. Ukraine wants real decolonization, doesn't want fake decolonization. What else should we practically ask as citizens? Well, personally, I would ask that my government not accommodate, at least at the level of language, not accommodate Israel's imposition of the additional siege, right? We've got a quote here from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk. The imposition of sieges that endangers the lives of civilians by depriving them of goods essential for their survival is prohibited under international humanitarian law. I'm not interested in my government being complicit in that. I don't want the 24-hour warning telling half of Gazans to move. They can't and they won't. So essentially, you're just creating justification you will later use to excuse extraordinary civilian casualties. I would hold off on massive bombardment of urban centers. I would engage with Egypt. I would engage with local powers to explore possibilities of facilitating some people to move, taking care of humanitarian emergency needs. So I'm not saying that's what I would do if I were Israel. I'm talking about what I would want my government to be or not to be verbally complicit in, right? And I've not been impressed by all the statements that I heard. Having said that, one other thing that's terribly unimpressive is the way, for instance, in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, at least in one statement I saw, the former leader of the Labour Party, did not outrightly condemn the Hamas attacks. He condemned them sort of, kind of, but it wasn't direct enough. And then I think, ethics aside, the ethics are not good here, but ethics aside, is a grave political mistake. It just doesn't help anybody. For instance, you want to recognize that pro-Palestinian Jewish Israelis are your allies here. And you know how much you hurt them by not condemning Hamas. So all the people who haven't condemned Hamas are in fact not helping the Palestinian cause because they're not acting constructively, they're not acting politically, forgetting about ethics. And that means that I would want my government to perhaps take the position that Israel should delay taking dramatic military action by some days. But let's come to this story about how this undermines Ukraine. And I want to put on the table an assumption that I highly recommend you not to adopt, but I'm going to put it on the table because what I'm going to say is going to be compatible with it. And that is the assumption that what Israel is doing is entirely proportionate. Because even if that was so, it just looks so bad for the West. From the point of view of much of the global South, from the point of view of many global agents, this makes the West's cries about what the Russians have done in many Ukrainian towns look selective and hypocritical. It looks, oh, you care about it there, but you don't care about it here. Now, even if that's just a perception, I'm saying that's a real perception. And so there is a kind of a tragic element here that inevitably weakens the West's capacity not just to grow, but to sustain an alliance of support and even an alliance of intelligibility around its support for Ukraine. There's a lot of agents, political agents, state agents, a lot of folks around the world are going to be looking at this and saying, this doesn't make sense. All of these international organizations seem to be saying humanitarian emergency, violation of international law, war crimes, war crimes, war crimes. The West seems like it's mostly cheering this on. How does this equate with Ukraine? Oh, surely they're making it up. They're just playing with their little interests there in Ukraine, and their commitment ain't real. And so the Ukrainian cause is probably not that real either. So that's an inevitable byproduct of the way this is going, even if one were to argue that Israel's response is entirely proportionate. Why is this a much more important point than what I can make it out to be now? It's because it shows the interconnection of global conflicts and how we're sliding into a certain kind of global war, which means that we can no longer understand conflicts a conflict at a time. And there is a real problem here because so many of you, I know, look so passionately at the brutal invasion of Ukraine by the Putin regime. And you may not look too deeply, some of you do, I know, but you may not look too deeply at other conflicts. But the point is, that leaves us assuming that 1 or 2 games are being played in that conflict. Whereas in fact, it's 6 or 7 games that are being played that can only be understood if we look at the complete global picture, right? So what's the deal between the US and China, right? And how that impacts the policy the US takes toward Ukraine and Russia. And it's only if we begin making these connections that we can actually produce a proper analysis of why various global political agents are doing what they're doing the way they're doing it. And it's only if we grasp that we'll be able to ourselves figure out what realistic account of agency is available to generate some of the outcomes that you might want to generate in the world. This conversation was a little bit whiplash-like for many of you, and I apologize about that, but lots of love and talk very soon.